Hey First Baptist Quincy kids, so we've been learning a lot about Abraham lately, and we learned that God made a promise to Abraham that he would have a big family. And so last week we learned about the present, about how God asked him to sacrifice his son Isaac. We know in the end that God provided a sacrifice instead so that Isaac would not die while Abraham was sacrificing him. And that is a picture of what God does later in the Bible when he sends his own son to be sacrificed for us. And so we're going to be learning about Isaac's family today. Isaac had two sons as well, and their names were Jacob and Esau. And remember, we learned our verse that had to do with Abraham was Abraham believed the Lord. At the end of our lesson, we're going to learn a new verse this week. So we're learning about Jacob today. That was Isaac's son. And if you're following along in the Jesus Storybook Bible, it's found on page 70, and it's called The Girl No One Wanted. So if you have a Bible at home after you listen to the lesson, this story that I'm going to be reading to you is from Genesis 29 and 30, and you can read that story straight from the Bible as well. There were once two sisters. The youngest sister was very beautiful, and her name was Rachel. But the oldest sister wasn't beautiful at all. Some thought her quite ugly, and her name was Leah. Rachel was the kind of girl who always gets invited to parties and chosen for the team. Everyone loved her, and poor Leah, no one hardly even noticed her. One day, their cousin Jacob came to stay. He was one of Isaac's sons, and he was on the run. Jacob had stolen and cheated and made some enemies, including his own brother, and now he was hiding. The funny thing is, Jacob, of all people, was the one God gave the special promise to. I will rescue the world through your family. But then God chooses people we least expect, as we'll see in this story. Jacob stayed a long time working for his uncle Laban. One day, Laban said, "Jacob, I've decided to pay for your work. What do you want?" A sudden thought struck him. How about one of my daughters? Jacob looked at Rachel and he looked at Leah. Who would he choose? Of course he chose Rachel. "I'll work 7 years for free," Jacob said, "if I can marry Rachel." So Jacob worked 7 years, and at last his wedding day arrived. But that night, Laban played a nasty trick on Jacob. Instead of sending Rachel to marry Jacob, he sent Leah instead. Now, in those days, they didn't have electricity, so their tent was really dark. And of course, women back then also wore veils that covered their face, so Jacob did not suspect anything. The next morning, Jacob woke up and screamed. His new wife was laying beside him, but it wasn't Rachel. It was Leah. Jacob jumped out of bed. "Laban!" he cried. "You scoundrel!" But Laban said, "Work for me another 7 years, and then you can marry Rachel." So Jacob worked for Laban another 7 years, and at last Rachel became his wife. Now Jacob had 2 wives, but of his 2 wives, Jacob loved Rachel the best. "No one loves me," Leah said. "I'm too ugly." But God didn't think she was ugly, and when he saw that Leah was not loved and that no one wanted her, God chose her to love her specially, to give her a very important job. One day, God was going to rescue the whole world, and he was going to use it through Leah's family. Now, when Leah knew that God loved her in her heart, suddenly it didn't matter anymore whether her husband loved her the best or if she was the prettiest. Someone had chosen her. Someone did love her, with a never stopping, never giving up, unbreaking, always and forever love. So when Leah had a baby boy, she called him Judah, which means, "This time I will praise the Lord." And that's just what she did. And you'll never guess what job God gave Leah. You see, when God looked at Leah, he saw a princess. And sure enough, that's exactly what she became. One of Leah's children's children would be a prince, the Prince of Heaven, God's son. This prince would love God's people. They wouldn't need to be beautiful for him to love them. He would love them with all of his heart. and they would be beautiful because he loved them, just like Leah. So that's the end of our story. I have a couple questions for you. So if you're sitting at home, we're going to be comparing Rachel and Leah, and I want to see how many of these you can get right by remembering our story about Rachel and Leah. All right, so our first question, or first statement I should say, is the younger sister. Was it Rachel or Leah? So the correct answer is, Rachel. It was Rachel. Who was the beautiful sister? Leah or Rachel? Again, it was Rachel. The older sister who no one noticed, Leah or Rachel? That was Leah. The sister Jacob wanted to marry, remember, that was Rachel. After 7 years, the sister Jacob first married, remember, he was tricked. He married Leah first. The second sister Jacob married was Rachel. The sister Jacob loved Rachel the most. The sister God chose to set his love on, that was Leah. The sister with a son named Judah, that was Leah again. And the sister through whose family God would rescue his people. Remember, Leah's children's children. So our answer was Leah. God chose Leah. Even though Jacob chose Rachel as the one he loved the most, God chose Leah and used her for extraordinary things. Her children's children would be God's only son that came to the earth for us. So we have a verse we're going to learn. It comes from Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. And if you have a Bible at home, I would love it if you looked that verse up. Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. And it says, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." And I want you to think about that. Leah was in a situation that really stinks. She was not the one that was loved the most by Jacob, but God used her for good. So when you're in a situation that isn't the best situation and you're thinking, man, this stinks, think about how God is going to use it for good. I hope you have a great week. I'll see you again next week. Bye, guys.